The green flag dropped.
Lost Vikings has kind of an interesting story about how it got started. Game had come out called Lemmings, and so that's actually how Lost Vikings started. It started with the idea that it would be a console game, and you would control hundreds of little tiny Viking units with different abilities.
It was this game with hundreds of little tiny blonde-haired 8-pixel tall Vikings, and it was very similar to Lemmings. You would have torch Vikings, you would have ladder Vikings, and you would use these different type of Vikings to scale castles, cross modes, defeat enemies.
And we wanted to build a whole game around that motif where you're trying to conquer enemy towns. So in some ways, sort of like a 2D side-scrolling version of what Warcraft was.
And then eventually it evolved down to fewer Vikings, 5 Vikings, 3 Vikings, 3 Vikings each with very specific abilities.
And as we were prototyping it, we realized that on a TV, those little units didn't look very good. And then we started to kind of think about how players of console games like a little more direct control as opposed to indirect.
If we were going up against these big games, Mario, Sonic, games like that, we needed to have characters that compete with them. And hundreds of little Vikings couldn't do it. And when we all sat down and were playing it, we all saw this. It wasn't like one person had this idea and we went and decided to change it. Everyone was seeing it and going, this just doesn't feel right. It's too slow. We need to make this game a little bit faster, a little bit more fun. Our characters need to be characters that you can associate with, not 8 pixels of torch-bearing Viking.
And the technical challenges were pretty large, and we didn't really have a perfect design for it. You know, we were still exploring. And gradually the game morphed over time to become first 5 Vikings with individual skills that you would work through a level. And then later, because it turned out to be really time consuming to think about how to get 5 Vikings to move through a level, down to just the 3 that we see today.
As they worked on it, they just kept kind of more specializing and specializing the Vikings until they were actually just down to 3. And I think it kind of, that's kind of carried over into some of other Blizzard games where they've really kind of trying to concentrate, you know, the coolness in individual units and characters rather than just have tons of characters that are just the same.
It made it really interesting to move these 3 different characters through the same level or parts of the same level. They didn't necessarily traverse exactly the same paths. But even when they did, because their ability sets were so different, it still played very differently. And that was part of the sort of the magic in the design of the levels and the sort of approach to the puzzle solving was, depending on the character you were playing, the same level would play very differently. That made it kind of interesting.
One of the challenges for the game Vikings was that you had to get all 3 characters to the end of the level. And so that meant that there was potentially a lot of having characters move across the same ground. Like, you know, you solve the puzzle and then everybody has to walk forward. And our original conception for that was that there was going to be an auto-follow feature that would enable all the characters to follow one of them. Although the levels were so dangerous that, you know, if you had one of the characters die because it was doing an auto-follow, that would have been really annoying. And it ended up being a feature we just didn't have time for in any event. So generally the levels were really compressed in that a lot of the action happens in a very small space, so the Vikings didn't have to travel very far in order to get to the exits. You might have one that went, you know, really far out of his way, like Olaf flying around trying to avoid a bunch of spikes, but then he comes back to where the other characters are and opens a door so that then they can get out of the level.
I think the main appeal of Lost Vikings is the 3 different characters, and not only are they're cool little Viking characters doing things that you would expect Vikings to do. We took them through time. So you're playing Vikings in prehistoric times, in future times, in crazy, wacky levels where you have these various monsters that are like a hand bouncing a ball that throws itself. Like, we just had fun with the game. We explored all these different sort of eras, and we had our 3 familiar Vikings to guide us through it. So it was almost like we were taking tours of these different environments and living them through the 3 different characters.
I remember we were just having to brainstorm different ways that the Vikings could work together or do things on their own, and what limitations they had when they were on their own, and just trying to come up with crazy situations. I think it was a willingness to try different things.
So as you went through the level, you had to use their skills differently or use whatever skill was appropriate for the area of the level you were in. So you'd see a problem and you'd say, which of the skills will be best here? Ooh, that's gonna be Olaf because he has the shield, but then he's already locked on the other side of the map. So, and you had to figure out how to get them into the right places at the right times with the right powers. I liked that. I like that puzzle solving aspect of it. They needed whatever ideas that they could come up with, whatever we could come up with for creating levels or ideas for the characters to have special powers or anything like that. Because even the three Vikings, they didn't have all of their special powers known at the time that we were developing the levels. By the time I did my level, we did know what the powers would be. So I built the powers into my level to make sure that I'd have 3 different areas where each character would get to do something interesting.
We had done some mock-ups of what the Vikings should look like and stuff like that, and Brian Fargo at Interplay and Alan Pavlish and them looked at them and just didn't think that they were cutesy enough or lovable enough. So they had given one of their artists, Todd, the assignment to design the Vikings in a way that would make them adorable and make them really cool for the players. And he did a fantastic job, and I think that even to this day, I think that it was probably one of the best decisions that was made.
I remember Alan coming in and having this huge list of criticisms for the game, but I don't really remember it being very harsh. I just remember it being really, really thorough. And like, oh, here's somebody who really cares, you know, about this game. And, you know, any one suggestion on its own wouldn't make the game any better, but doing them all would, you know, turn the game from like, you know, a B quality game into an A game easily. Just having somebody thoroughly go through it from the outside, it was invaluable.
When I think back to Lost Vikings, probably the first thing that comes to mind for me is the graphics, the vibrant, colorful graphics. I think because it was a Nintendo game, and if you think about the other console games at the time, things like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario, they were so vibrantly neon colored. We went that direction too, and so the colors really pop when I think about, you know, in my mind's eye what Lost Vikings was. And that's another one of those lessons that even, you know, many, many years later, you still see those sort of approach, colorful, vibrant backgrounds in the games today. And, you know, Overwatch is a great example of a beautiful, vibrant, colorful world in a genre that's typically pretty sort of, you know, dusty and dark and gray.
Well, being that my first gig, my first task for Blizzard was to convert the sound and music for Lost Vikings to PC format, I got exposed to it heavily, and I mean, it was a new job, so I didn't question it, but yeah, when I took a step back and thought about it, like, why are these Lost Vikings in space? And I guess as the story unfolds, it explains why that happened, although it's still a little bit far-fetched. I don't know who came up with that idea, but yeah, it sounds like an artist idea.
As far as the design for Lost Vikings, the backgrounds and stuff like that, we literally were just, what would be fun? What would meet the Super Nintendo's audience as to what would be quirky, what would stand out, and we were trying to come up with an idea as to how we could get them in these different environments that didn't make any sense. So at the time, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on about alien abductions, so we had them abducted by an alien, and it was pretty funny because then we could take them and drop them into anywhere. So we could drop them into a factory zone, we could drop them into the goofy world, we could drop them into just about anywhere and everywhere, and we had designs for all kinds of things. So it was all pretty much dependent on what kind of artwork we can draw and stuff like that. So we started doing a lot of artwork. Part of my job at the time was also to take all that artwork and convert it into something that's usable on the Super Nintendo. So those digital limitations for that, as well as making sure that they fit within the color palettes for how Super Nintendo and the Sega systems were laid out, it was a very mind-racking existence that continued on into Warcraft 1, because I used that to lay out all the levels in Warcraft 1 as well.
So when I think back to Lost Vikings, there's a story in particular that helped sort of form Blizzard's design philosophies. We had just come out with it. We had heard that there was a Virgin Megastore nearby that had a kiosk showing the game. So drove over there eagerly at lunch and saw there were actually 4 kiosks side by side showing different games, and Lost Vikings was one of them. And I got there just in time to see this boy, probably 13 or 14 years old, walk up and pick up the controller for Lost Vikings. It was the very first level. And the very first thing, one of the first things you have to do is you take Eric and you just move him a little bit to the right, and he has to jump over this pit of electricity and then open a door on the other side. And that's literally all you had to do. We're just trying to teach players how to jump with Eric. He picked up the controller, he took 2 steps to the right, fell into the electricity, put the controller down, and moved to the next game. And I just thought, oh my God, we killed this poor kid in the first 2 seconds of the game. He's never gonna know what an amazing game this is. And so that lesson formed the basis of the philosophy that we use in everything we do now, which is making the onboarding of new players to the game as safe and easy as possible. You want your players right from the start to feel heroic and powerful and competent. And I hope that 14-year-old went back one day and tried a second time, but that lesson for me stands out as a watershed moment in Blizzard design philosophy.
Lost Vikings, it's funny because people that have played games a long time, you say Lost Vikings, a lot of people know what it is and have heard of it. They just don't know that Blizzard had anything to do with it. They don't know that we were Silicon and Synapse. So there was a lot of technical hurdles and things like that that we had to overcome. My understanding from Alan, even though I didn't know it at the time, was that I always believed he knew technically what we needed to do and that he was leading us, but he admitted later, like many, many years later in an interview that he did, they were making it up for the most part because all the manuals that they had from Nintendo were in Japanese and they couldn't read them. And back then you didn't have online translations. So there were a lot of those kind of difficulties, but feeding off each other and helping each other, we're able to, as a team, come together to make a really good game in sometimes very difficult situations. There's just so many special moments in that game that makes me go back to it all the time and want to always call it my favorite game ever.
So Rock and Roll Racing actually is sort of the spiritual sequel to a game we made called RPM Racing. In RPM Racing, we didn't fully understand the trade-offs between high-res mode and the standard mode. You might naturally think high-res is better because you have more pixels on the screen. The problem with that was back in those days, for memory efficiency, the way you made games was you drew a cell and then replicated that cell as many times as you wanted to build a level or build a scene out of a background of cells. And that was a very efficient way, memory efficient way. Now, if you used high-res cells, you had many fewer cells to work with. So later on, we sort of joked that RPM Racing was high-res grass. And we learned from that lesson when we pivoted after RPM Racing to Rock and Roll Racing that standard mode let us get so many more cells, and that in fact let us make more varied levels. And that was kind of the early beginnings of how we define the look of Rock and Roll Racing.
Light them up!
So we're trying to come up with ideas for what to make Rock and Roll Racing better than RPM Racing, because all of us played RPM Racing and it was just slow and it wasn't fun. You kept running into the sides of the track. There was all kinds of things that were going on that were just not really good. So when we started talking about Rock and Roll Racing, weapons on the cars, about doing all these things to make it actually a fun game.
We pulled the camera back a little bit. I also sped up the cars. I literally made them travel faster. Making the cars faster and making the track bigger to accommodate that speed helped a lot. It was actually quite technically challenging to get that done though, because the game was not designed originally to have bigger tracks. That was probably the toughest technical challenge outside of just trying to cram a big game into a small cartridge. I think it was only 128K that you could even have for the entire game. Everything, code, data, everything.
What he had to do was figure out how to take each system that was the game was running and squeeze down the amount of time that they took so that he could get the same amount of action into fewer, video frames. Some systems ran every single frame every 60th of the second, and other systems would only run once every 3 frames in order to make it all work together. And he would go literally line by line fixing things, both to make the game smaller so it would fit in the 8 megabit cartridge and run faster to be able to squeeze all the systems in.
In terms of the gameplay, we loved the racing component of RPM racing, but rock and roll looks so much better. And then, you add missiles and mines and smoke fields and oil spray, and now you've really got something fun in terms of the racing and in terms of the combat element to it. So it just came together and felt and played amazing.
I think the appeal of rock and roll racing is just racing games are always fun. And if you can blow things up while you're racing, it's even funner. Because there's a certain thing about being able to get in front of your friend while you're racing and then hit him with a rocket from behind or hit him with an oil slick to where he spins out. Or not only testing your racing skills, but you're testing your skills to be able to fight while you're racing.
When you're building a game, if the game just plays the same every single time, you pretty rapidly get bored with it. And this is in the days before the internet existed and people could patch games. So we had to make a game that was self-sufficient and would last for long periods of time, that people would play and play and play and play. And so some of those elements are just adding upgrades to the game. It just seems natural, like if you've got a car, you just want to make it better and better over time so you get rewarded for your playing. One of the challenges is that you really have to balance it carefully. And again, a lot of credit goes to Bob for solving these problems. Because, if you're in the lead and you have a lot of weapons to use against your opponent, then the opponent will never catch up. And so most of the weapons are pretty weak if you're the lead racer. Like oil slicks don't do that much against you, and mines don't do that much. Whereas the missiles are actually quite powerful because it's fired by the person who's in the back. But you can't make it too powerful because then the trick is get behind somebody, shoot them, and then win the race.
So one of the innovations of rock and roll racing was putting real rock and roll music into the game. And the person who gets credit for that is actually Brian Fargo, including the name Rock and Roll Racing. It was like one of those ideas that just seemed so obvious when you hear about it. You think to yourself, why hasn't someone else already done this? Why isn't everybody doing this? The first company we contacted, or the first musician we contacted, was actually ZZ Top. We thought, hey, maybe we'll call this ZZ Top's Racing or ZZ Top's Rock and Roll Racing. The amount of money, the price tag, basically, for us to be able to get them was prohibitive. It was too expensive. So we thought, okay, that's the issue. That's why no one is doing this, because it just costs too much. And then we contacted a music service that provides sort of low-cost licensed music in public settings, elevators and things like that. And when we looked through their library, we found there were a ton of cool songs in there. And so we licensed, I think, about a half a dozen songs at a reasonable price, and we were able to adapt them into the hardware at the time. And it was like peanut butter and chocolate. It was just perfect.
You could always make the cars go faster or paint them red, because red is always the fastest color. But I think it was the addition of heavy metal that made everyone just drive a little bit more frantically, and it upped the game a little bit. My favorite track on Rock and Roll Racing would probably be Highway Star.
What songs did we know that made you want to go out and drive? And I had brought up this song, Highway Star. I said to the guys, I go, here's the song that I would put, here's the song I would use. And they had never heard of it, so I played it for them. That one got in, and then Radar Love got in, and a couple others that were on, and then it was all about being able to license them. And back then, it wasn't like today where, because of Guitar Hero and all the rock and roll games, it's very difficult to get a license that's going to cost more than what your game is.
We, as developers, even way back then, had a tremendous passion for music ourselves. I mean, I remember one afternoon we were at the office and we just happened to hear a radio ad on the commercial for a concert that was going to be going on that night, and tickets were still available. We literally got in the car, drove down the road to the venue, bought tickets, and went to the concert.
I can still hear that song playing in my head, and I can hear Larry Huffman with "The stage is set, the green flag drops."
The stage is set, the green flag drops.
The idea of putting voice in there, like a race caller's voice into the game, that was another one of those ideas, just like putting rock and roll music into the game, that when we thought about it, seemed really obvious. Why aren't more people doing this? And again, we thought there must be some sort of technological reason for it. But as we explored it, we realized we could get great compression rates, and we could replay that audio, the voice tracks, at high fidelity, and then it would sound great.
Let the carnage begin!
I think it was Brian Fargo in Interplay that managed to do it, was get Larry Huffman to come and do the actual calling of the races.
Part of how I knew who he was, and maybe even why we ended up getting him, was there used to be this local racing competition, something Speedway, I don't remember exactly, but that's how I knew him, was from the radio. So I would hear it a lot on the radio, and if I were going to imitate him, I'd have to do not something from rock and roll racing, but what I used to hear all the time, which was, "Sunday, Sunday, Sunday."
Cat lights him up!
He loved profanity, and so there were a lot of comments we couldn't even use that were hilarious, but it's like, nope, Nintendo is definitely not going to approve that one. All right, well, let's move on to the next one. But there wasn't a whole lot of space on the cartridge for things like audio clips, and so we really had to pick and choose the ones we could get on there and make sure that they were compressed so that they didn't take much space. So that was one challenge. And then the second one was just to make sure that they were played at the right time in the race so that it made sense in accordance with the action that was going on, and also not to be too repetitive.
And it worked beautifully. One of the innovations that really makes rock and roll racing feel like rock and roll racing was Larry's voice.
Rip was lost out there. Holy Toledo!
I had a whole bunch of clips that they had given me, and all I needed to do was find trigger points, what I called trigger points, where if something happened in the game and I wanted to highlight it, then I would just call one of the little clips, and I would either pick them randomly or have one associated with a particular action. Like if somebody blew up somebody else and I could detect that the missile was shot from a long way away, then maybe I could know, oh, that was probably a really good shot. That was shot from way over here, it hit way over there. So I'll play a special clip right here, like, oh, look at that shot or something. What are some of the things that he said? So it was just find proper moments. When are things where you as a player would want to hear something? And we would know those by playing the game. I'd play the game tons. In fact, that's how I knew rock and roll racing was going to be a big hit, was in any game. I do this with all the games. If you spend all day long working on the game, and then before you go home, what you want to do instead of going home is play the game some, you know you're working on a hit. And any time that a moment would go by where I'd think, oh, there should have been something there, I would just go back to the code and change it and put something there. And over time, you stop saying to yourself, oh, I wish there were something there, because now you've got them all, and now you've got your game.
In rock and roll racing, we brought a lot of the Blizzard humor into it. It was still in its early stages, but we were having fun with our games. Like in the backgrounds, there's a sign for Viking Cola. There was also Olaf from Lost Vikings. He was one of the secret characters in rock and roll racing that you can play. And we were just having fun with these games. Whenever, we pushed it from a normal racing game on boring dirt tracks to racing in outer space, right? To racing on inferno planets with aliens, blasting away at you. And that was just the sort of birth of what Blizzard did with all of the games, what we did to fantasy and sci-fi and horror. was all started back in those little games that took a year to make, and we were just kind of having fun with it. We didn't look at it as we were trying to be radically different. We were saying, hey, we can do whatever we want, let's do it. And I think that set the tone for future Blizzard games.
Blackthorne's story was the beginning, sort of Blizzard learning to tell stories. We had a little bit of it with Lost Vikings, but it was so tongue-in-cheek as to almost not be serious. But Blackthorne, we start to kind of take ourselves a little bit serious in our writing and how we think about stories and character development. The idea for Blackthorne came from a couple other games that were among the first to use rotoscoping. One was called Flashback, and I think it was on console, and I remember seeing that and just thinking, oh my God, the animations are so lifelike, they're amazing. Had never seen anything like that before. We just thought, wow, we have to do something like this.
They looked at that game and it was, it was beautiful. It wasn't the game they wanted to make, but they really wanted to get that nice kind of just smooth motion.
And seeing those games was something we felt like, hey, we can do that too. We can make a game that looks like that and has those kinds of sensibilities. And so it led to the creation of Blackthorne, where it's actually like a rotoscoped game. And for those who don't know what rotoscoping is, that's where you film somebody and watch their motions and then either mimic those motions in drawing or just paint right over the video.
So what they did is they filmed us doing the various actions of the character in the game with a broom or a stick for the gun. And I remember like lunging forward like, 100 times so that they could film that. And
I remember the day we brought the video camera in. One of the guys brought in a ladder. It might have been Stu Rose. And we were climbing up and down the ladder, filming ourselves, and then, taking it back and getting it into the computer frame by frame to see what those sprites might look like.
Stu had this idea to take Frank out in the back of the backfield behind the office and have him run and walk and jump and do all these things and then film him from the side doing them all and then use that as the inspiration for the animations that he was creating for the main character. And Stu went out and filmed him running and jumping, doing all these things. He brought them back in and then started using them as the guide for doing the actual animations. And then I think he even was able at one point be able to get the video into the computer, which at that time was a very difficult thing to do. And then he just drew over them. But that's how the main animations were originally made. The other animations with him climbing and doing all the things that Frank didn't do in the backyard were Stu just being a great artist and being able to match that look and feel.
And they did it over and over and over again, like, oh, your foot placement was wrong. We need to get like 2 full steps. We just didn't have enough space to do it correctly against a background that was really blank. There's nowhere else that we could do it because we didn't have a sound studio or anything. People were running around with guns and crawling and dodging and ducking with different implements in their hand to simulate what gun combat would look like. If you look at the way that Super Nintendo artwork is drawn, it's composed into a bunch of 8x8 blocks of pixels called cells. And so the challenge is you want to minimize the number of cells that you're using to try and keep the game size small. And so rotoscoped artwork, it seems like a great cost savings. Hey, we'll just record people and then we can use that in the game. But it had to be drawn over really extensively. It seems like a great cost savings, but really it was an enormous amount of work for the artists to take that video and convert it into something that could be used for the game.
And we would go through this elaborate process to cut out the character, and then we would take those frames and we would draw over them meticulously with the 15 colors that we were allowed. And what we ended up doing was, instead of rotoscoping, we said, how many frames does this character have to do? Oh, 16? Okay, we'll just do a 16-frame animation, and we'll just kind of put that rotoscoping stuff to the side. We did it once or twice. It was the biggest pain in the butt, and then we figured out we're just going to do it ourselves. Just make a guy climb a ladder for 16 frames, and lo and behold, it looks so smooth and lifelike and fluid. So we were used to games where we had 3 frames, 5 frames of animation in Lost Vikings, so having 16 made it feel like we were just creating these most beautiful animations the world had ever seen.
We just wanted to try our hand at something a little bit different. We'd done Lost Vikings, we'd done Rock and Roll Racing. Those were both really tongue-in-cheek. Back in those days, we really liked pushing ourselves and liked creating new things, different things. So different game types, in this case, different stories in a different tone.
I'm asked a lot about Blackthorne and why Blackthorne was so different from Lost Vikings, which was very, very colorful and happy and sweet and very Nintendo type, Mario type feel to it. We pulled back from that and then started coming up with the ideas for how the game would look. So Sam and Ron and the other artists started coming up with ideas and doing some things. And Sam hit, I believe it was Sam that hit a really good idea for how some of the levels would look and stuff like that. So we started designing levels based on how those looks would be. The whole thing about Blackthorne rests on one thing. If at the very beginning of the game, you have Kyle. Kyle's there and he's got his shotgun. And that was what the whole game was about. We were thinking about Ash and the Evil Dead. We were thinking about Big Trouble in Little China. We were thinking about Escape from New York. We were thinking about all of these visions where it's just this hero, this more anti-hero who just, you know what, let's just go in with a shotgun and clear it all out, you know. It was just a lot of fun, and yes, it was very dark, but it's very much in line with the sense of humor we had.
So we had just made Lost Vikings, Rock and Roll Racing, and we were working on Blackthorne. Blackthorne was even a little bit heavier and a little bit darker to begin with. Originally, this character, he didn't even have a name yet, but he was searching for these missing kids. There was this little cinematic that we did where the newspaper says, child missing, this and that. And so basically, the story was at the time where there was this detective guy searching for these kids, and he found that they were taken to this other realm, and he was going to go through and try to rescue them. And so we still have that idea of a person from our world going to this other world, but we changed it around a bit because it was just feeling too heavy. It felt a little more of a darker R-rated movie than sort of a PG-13 that Blackthorne ended up being.
Some of it was just a function of the ideas that we had. Some of it was a function of the games that we were playing. And with Blackthorne, I would point to some of the games that we were playing at the time as well, because I remember playing a whole lot of Wolfenstein 3D in the office, and that was pretty dark and gritty. And so those first-person shooters that were dark and gritty were something we were playing at the time, and I think we thought we could sort of bring that gritty experience to the platformer space.
For Blackthorne, the idea behind it was, there was a guy with long hair and a shotgun going around killing monsters. It was a very nightmarish setting, so the idea there was to highlight the weirdness of this nightmare that he'd fallen into, sort of a living nightmare that you can't wake up from.
Blackthorne was our first anti-hero. He was a hero, but he was kind of a bad guy or a tough guy, or, he played on the darker side of the street, right? We had this long, black-haired character, dubious nature. So you can see a little bit of the elements of Blackthorne in characters like Illidan and characters like Arthas. Bad guys, sometimes good guys, of dubious nature. But I believe the birth from them came from our first anti-hero, Kyle Blackthorne.
And when I think about the early days of Blackthorne, I'm sure we experimented with a few different things. I don't remember exactly. We landed on the shotgun, and it just was amazing and so visceral and so satisfying. We knew that was the weapon for the game.
Even though it was sort of silly in some ways, and when you're doing shotgun combat, you duck back into sometimes nothing. You just sort of stand back and well, why can't you be shot there? You're just standing. But it didn't really matter, right? It played well and it was fun, and so it was an enjoyable game experience. And I think at the time it was probably the most violent game that had been done on Super Nintendo, that really showed people the extremes that Nintendo would allow on their system.
I think the appeal of Blackthorne comes from the fact that it's a really good escape, because it's basically you as a human being placed in an unhuman world and then having to survive it and work your way through it. I think that we put some pretty good hidden things in there You know, I think that as people find them, they find that it's not just a walk left to right or right to left or up and down. There's a lot of puzzle, there's a lot of thought put into it. It really was a solid game. So there was a lot of those kind of things where it was just like, everything was actually interactive. We tried to make anything and everything move or do something or part of the storyline.
So one of the cool things about Blackthorne is it had Blizzard's very first orc. I don't know if you remember it, but there would be the little bad guys that you fought, and then when they shot you, they would go, ha, ha, ha. Right? They're basically orcs. They have little chainmail on, they have the sort of orky bulldog face with the little tusks, and we made them green, we made them blue, we've made them red, and so far I think Warcraft has had red and green orcs. No blue ones yet, maybe, we'll see. WoW team, listen up. But that's a fun little side note, I think, that many people wouldn't have known, is that the first Blizzard orcs were in Blackthorne. Now, wait a minute, I'm actually thinking, I think our first orc might have actually been in Rock and Roll Racing as one of the bad guys that you play against. I think it was Bogmire, and it was the character for that. So, two fun little anecdotes for you. Blizzard and orcs, since 1993.
So it's funny thinking back to the long ago when we started Silicon and Synapse, what now became Blizzard Entertainment. We really had no idea what we were doing. We were fresh out of college. We just thought it would be fun to make games, and in our wildest dreams could never have imagined that Blizzard would become what it is today.
I started working for Blizzard in February of 1992.
Yeah, it was like, let's learn how to make games. Let's see what it's like to be a professional developer. This is awesome.
You do the math. If I was 30 when I started at Blizzard in 91, yes, I will be 60 next year, which is a scary thought because the 30 years went by pretty quick.
My very first title when I joined the company, I don't think I had one, but as soon as we got business cards, my first title was music director, I think.
I was the second employee, fourth person on board, and so Frank was sitting in the front office, which was quite small, and had a kitchen sink in it. And then Alan had a middle office, which was even smaller, but had a door. And then Mike and I shared the back office, and it wasn't that big either.
Alan had brought me in. We went into his office. We had a quick talk about what he expected from me from work, and then put me at the desk right behind Frank in the front room. He also said that I had to help answer the phones because we didn't have a receptionist, and Frank was answering the phones, and so he put me on the phones. So Frank and I would switch off answering the phones. Which is weird because at that time, both Frank and I were pretty grumpy people. I got over being grumpy. I think Frank is still pretty grumpy, but that's just Frank.
We wanted to make games. We wanted to make games that we wanted to play. We wanted to make games that other people would want to play. It was really about, you know, being able to earn a living while doing something we loved. And that was really Alan's charter was, let's just make games and have some fun.
We didn't have any real highbrow goals. We were just a bunch of kids just graduated from college.
We just wanted to make games that lots of people would love and play for long periods of time.
And making a bunch of them. We made games so fast back in the day. I remember working on two games at a time sometimes.
You know, philosophically, the way we approached making games was we just played a ton of games. It's what we love to do. It's why we started the company. And that was kind of where we got the inspiration for most of our ideas. We'd play other games, and the things we liked is sort of what we then thought we could do better, and that's what we wanted to make.
In the 1985, 86, 87, the big thing was to go to the mall and go to the stand-up arcade room, where there would be 100 different stand-up arcades. And one of the ones that I played a lot at that time was Pole Position. So when the job opportunity came along, they wanted to hire me to work on Rock and Roll Racing. They asked me what games I loved, and I told them, oh, I love playing Pole Position and various other games. And so apparently that was a pretty good indication that maybe I would be a right fit.
I came from television, where I worked making graphics for television back in late 80s and the early 90s. And I believe I interviewed February 9th, I believe. And it was really sad because I showed up in a suit, and Alan had told me later, he goes, we made so much fun of you because you showed up in a suit that it was ridiculous. And I go, that's okay, you hired me, so obviously I did something right.
My first day at Blizzard was learning how to use a computer. I had never really owned a computer. I've played on it a few times, but I had never used a mouse before. I had never used any art programs. I've played a lot of video games, but that was different than the programs that we used to create them. So my first day was learning how to turn on a computer, how to format a disk, use a mouse, draw pixel by pixel, learn how to use only 15 colors per character.
I showed up in a I Love Toxic Waste t-shirt that I had seen out of Real Genius, because I had always thought, the day that I go work for a company, I want it to be the kind where I can show up in a Tasmanian devil eating a peace sign with I Love Toxic Waste on the back, and they'll say, he fits in.
I remember coming down to Blizzard for the first time, Silicon Synapse back then, and driving from LA down to Orange County. And sure enough, there was traffic on the 405, and it took me probably over 2 hours to get down here. And I was just like, oh, I was like so sorry. And like, they're like, oh, it happens all the time.
Kind of a funny story about the name itself, Silicon and Synapse. Maybe there's a tiny bit of a goal encapsulated there. Silicon, the building block of the computer, and Synapse, the building block of the human mind. The problem was, no one knew what either of those really meant or how to spell it. So it was a terrible name for us to call the company. And of course, a couple years in, we ended up switching it to Blizzard Entertainment.
Rock and roll racing was a little bit underdeveloped when I came in. It was what they were hiring me for. The engineer who had been working on it had left the company, and they needed to fill that spot. So they had an interview, which was one of those roundabout things. A friend of a friend told me that someone's cousin needed somebody. It turned out that that was Alan Adham, who they were talking about, that needed somebody to come in. I
sat down, and then I had to convert my knowledge of the digital arts 3D program that I was using in television to the Macintosh 3D program that they had given me. So I had to do a lot of conversion and stuff like that. And I just started literally I think the first car that I built was a Jeep, and put it all together, and then did some tests with it, and then was just basically building the foundations for building the rest of the cars.
And then when we moved on to PC games and you had more than 15 colors, I still found myself using a smaller selection and keeping the colors simple and bright. And a lot of that's attributed to the Blizzard art style was based in the old games that we did, where we had a lot of limited resources and a limited space that we could do it in, and we just used whatever we had and tried to just dominate whatever game we were working on, whether it was a comedy, action adventure, racing game, it didn't matter, it was a Blizzard game.
Notice that the office was not what I was used to, because in television your head's down most of the time because you're working on stuff. But here everybody seemed to talk to each other, everybody seemed to get along really good, and I really enjoyed the first week there, and never looked back.
One of the main things it meant to be working at Blizzard in the early days is that your car would break down, you would get dumped by your girlfriend, and you would need a place to stay. Like, all three of those happened to most people. Some people, one or two of them only happened. And another thing that happened when you joined Blizzard, you had to make a desk.
We would buy these really cheap desks that would come in a really narrow box. It was tall, thin, and heavy. And it's like, all right, your first job is to assemble your desk. And some people have really good mechanical aptitude and they'd be fine. And other people, it would take them several days and they'd get injured, or their desks would be rickety and like prone to like falling over.
I was one of the lucky ones that my desk was already built when I got there.
No, I hired to be a game developer, not a furniture assembly person. But yeah, lots of people went through it, and it was just part of the culture of like coming on board. Maybe a bit of a hazing ritual even.
We were just a bunch of guys who were trying to make really cool games and make ends meet. I think it wasn't until a little bit later that we started solidifying some of our, what do we actually want to do here as we go forward, because this is taking off and we're going to be a real company.
But mostly we just wanted to have a good time. We were young, make some games, and never could have imagined how this would have all had turned out.
And as far as I know, I'm the only person from back in the day that's never made a desk. And now I've actually told that to you, so everyone's going to hear it. And now I'm going to have to make a damn desk. God, can we cut this part? When we were creating, the early games, Lost Vikings, games like that, we were all sort of coming from PC backgrounds in terms of art. Well, that artwork doesn't look that great on console games, Super Nintendo, Sega. So we started pushing the style of our art, instead of being little tiny little characters, starting to give them a bit more of a personality. And when you have more personality, you can play up with the humor and the drama of these things. So we could do animations that were more comical or more exaggerated. And a lot of that is where the sort of Blizzard style really started developing. It wasn't with Warcraft, it wasn't with StarCraft, it was these early games where we really started to define what a Blizzard game was and how a Blizzard game should look.
We had a lot of fun. We had the character of the company was more about enjoying what we do, making really cool stuff, showing off what we can do to each other, and really just advancing what we were doing as much as possible.
I think humor was important early on. I think most of that came from Alan Adham.
The company was pretty small up through Lost Vikings and Rock and Roll Racing, maybe only around 20 of us. And we were all pretty fresh out of college, or in some cases not even yet through college. And so the environment in early Blizzard was more like the environment of a fraternity house.
I remember we were at, I believe it was CES back in the day, and Rock and Roll Racing, I think, was either nominated at the time. We eventually won like a game of show for Rock and Roll Racing. Larry Huffman was at the show, and for some reason, he got in his mind that Bob Fitch did everything on the game, the programming, the art, everything. So Bob was there, and we were just having a blast with it. Bob was there, and Larry's like, yeah, everyone come check out Rock and Roll Racing. Bob Fitch is the creator of this game. And Bob was loving it, and we were like goading him on and saying like, hey, how'd you make that art? What made you think of this and that? And it was just a super fun time. So Blizzard didn't make Rock and Roll Racing. Bob Fitch did. Bob told me to say that too. I think he's gonna give me a cool $20 for that.
I grew up in Irvine here, my parents in Irvine, and we started the company here in Irvine. So my folks didn't come over too often, but one day my mom stopped by just to see, kind of what her son was up to. And it was interesting. It would be like having your mom visit you at your fraternity house. Some pretty colorful language. I think one of our artists, Roman, was walking around in a bathrobe.
He would do combat rolls down the hallway. He would make guitar sounds and laser sounds with his mouth just as he was walking down the hall.
We were all, of course, sitting around playing video games, so it was kind of hard for my mom to imagine that that was an actual company.
So I had gotten really good at taking the car and just quickly turning it to the side, shooting, and then turning it back so that I could get the shot to hit in just the right spot where I knew somebody else, I was leading the target, where they were about to go into it from a whole nother screen. I couldn't even see them on my screen, but I'd get them. So I did that to Frank Pierce one day. We were in the tightest race. He was way ahead of me, and I shot him from way off screen, blew up his car. All the other cars raced by him. I raced by him, put him in 4th place, and then I finished in 1st and he finished in 4th. He threw his arms in the air and he goes, "God damn it, Bob, you dickweed." And then we hear from behind us this very soft clearing of a throat. And everybody turns around and looks back, and it's Alan Adham. And he says, hey everybody, because the whole company was there, all 20 of us or so, playing, watching. He goes, hey everybody, I would like to introduce you to my mom. Frank's face, white.
I don't remember, but it sounds like Frank and Bob.
Yeah, that was a good rock and roll racing time.
One of the things that we always try to do in our games is make sure that we were hitting on all cylinders. And that was, that the graphic quality was there, the sound, the gameplay, and humor just seemed to be another element.
I remember humor always being very important in our games, and I think most of that came from Alan Adham. He felt that it kind of helped people have something to remember when they were done playing the game and be able to share that with friends. And kind of, games can be kind of even a little bit stressful while you're playing and you're in this, you're really paying attention on what's going on, and the humor kind of breaks that up a little bit.
It was a simpler time back then, right? Like, you didn't have these massive epic storylines in video games. Like, you could get away with doing things a lot more straightforward and simply back then. And so a simple, clever joke here or there adds a lot, but doesn't overdo it. I don't know, in some respects, I think we were very fortunate that we just struck the right balance with the content that we were creating and putting into those products.
If things were funny, then we did it,
If anybody knew anything about you, it was brought up on a daily basis. And if it was something that was embarrassing or funny, it was brought up several times on a daily basis.
So we were joking around all the time, having a great time, laughs left and right. And so that naturally worked its way into our games. When I think back to Lost Vikings, probably the first thing that comes to mind for me is the graphics, the vibrant, colorful graphics. I think because it was a Nintendo game, and if you think about the other console games at the time, things like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario, they were so vibrantly neon colored. We went that direction too, and so the colors really pop when I think about, in my mind's eye, what Lost Vikings was.
A lot of people ask me about why Blizzard's art style is so vibrant, why the colors are so rich and all that stuff. And they always, I love listening to their theories about how the theories that come up actually really make me laugh.
One of the things that Alan wanted to do was make the artists work under poor light conditions. What that meant was, you had to draw under these fluorescent lights, and so everything had to be really bright and cartoony in order to show up under those lighting conditions.
In all honesty, we sat and we would do the artwork. Sam and I would work on the artwork, and then we show it to Alan. Because Alan was colorblind, he wouldn't be able to see the difference between some colors. So he'd go, "Can you bring the colors up a little more so that I can see them?" And he just kept saying that. And so we would bring them up, he would see them, he'd approve them, then we'd bring them back down for the game, and then we go on. And then one day we just left them up, and that's all there was to it. No magic. It wasn't that we suffered for our art or anything like that. It was just that Alan was colorblind and you need to be able to see it.
When you look at the art style of Blizzard, obviously it became really refined in a lot of the later games, but it started out because we had a mixture of people who were like fresh game industry artists who hadn't done anything before, like Sam Didier, who had worked at a movie theater before coming to Blizzard, was like really talented artists on paper, but hadn't had any computer experience. We're all sort of teaching each other and learning each other's styles, and gradually it just evolved that they had a lot of similar elements they wanted to convey, like sense of power in some of the heroes and villains. And they just started drawing stuff and fed off each other, and it turned out to be a great style.
So one of the interesting things about the business of making games back then, or the art of making games back then, was teams were so much smaller. Today teams are 200, 300 and up. Back then you could make a game start to finish in just a few months with 4 or 5 people.
That could all hear each other. If one of us sneezed, the person furthest away would say Gesundheit. Right now, if you wanted to go from one corner of Blizzard to the other corner of Blizzard, just here in Irvine, how long do I think it would take? It would probably take a minute to walk across the first quad, and then you got to wait for the light, and then you have to cross a street, and then you have to walk through the second quad, and that's going to take you maybe a 4-minute walk at least to go from one corner of Blizzard to the other corner of Blizzard. 4 minutes.
Yeah, when I run into old school folks at the company, it usually brings back some good memories.
I think that most of the things that we did back at Silicon and Synapse were a team effort that all of us pitched in and all of us fed off each other and all of us came up with some really good ideas to solve problems that had come before us, both artistically and program-wise.
We had a lot of ideas for things we could accomplish back in the old Super Nintendo and Genesis days, and we just couldn't get funding for it. You know, we were a young game company, we didn't have a lot of credibility yet, and so like lots of people talked to us, but nobody wanted to give us the money. Which I still think was surprising because, you know, we were the first American team to release a game on Super Nintendo. The first 10 titles, 9 of them were Japanese and 1 Silicon and Synapse game. So I felt like they should have given us a shot and we could have done some amazing stuff.
I think the biggest problems that we had to solve were mostly financial, because though we made some really good Nintendo games and we were doing ports as fast as we could in order to keep the doors open, there were times when money was very scarce.
Blizzard didn't pay very much at the time, so the way that I made more money was I was working at home in my spare time doing a conversion of Blackthorne from Super Nintendo to PC, as well as being the lead on Warcraft during the day. So it was insane the number of hours that I was working to try and accomplish both those projects to make literally just a few $1,000s more. We really suffered in the early years of Blizzard.
Mike and Alan, to their credit, would go and they found out that they could go to the local store and cash in their American Express cards for cash, and then take that cash and put it in their bank account so that they could pay us when times got low while they were waiting for royalty checks to come in. So I think that that was one of the reasons, even though we didn't know at the time, we knew that there were some struggles going on.
And the next thing you know, everybody loves the games, and you're making another and another, and you're 30 years later, and people are getting the retro package where you can play them again and love them. It's not something I ever would have expected. So I don't even know how to react to finding out that 30 years later, people are still loving the work and playing the work. It's gratifying. I'm honored that people love this stuff so much.
You know, I'm really heartened by the success that Blizzard has had over the years. It was so exciting to be able to do games and then that players loved and would keep playing for years. And so it's really cool that Blizzard is now on its 30th anniversary. You know, I only worked there for about the first 9 years, but the company just continued from success to success, and it's now something that everybody knows about. You know, if it's one of the top game companies in the world that people can name, it's Blizzard.
Back in the early days, before we were known, you know, there was one sort of standout moment for me when I knew kind of our games were going to become popular. And it was, I forget exactly who I was talking to, but I'd flown up to Nintendo and had a meeting up at Nintendo, and I remember the producer I was talking with there saying that the president of Nintendo America had mentioned to him that the only 2 games not made by Nintendo that he had played to completion were Lost Vikings and Blackthorne. And so that was a pretty amazing moment. And, you know, not that the president of Nintendo was necessarily a fan, but for me, that was a watershed moment to hear that the president of this storied company knew who we were, was playing our games, and loved them enough to play them all the way through.